Folks, this is chapter 27, part A, the reproductive system, and we're talking about the male reproductive system. Although we were beginning this in lecture this week and get right into, and I believe this is slide 14. And so let's talk about the anatomy of the reproductive system, the male reproductive system, in fact, and talk about the testes. So we'll talk about the testes and talk a little bit about sperm production, where the testes are found, what we call the anatomical name of some of that stuff, and then also talk about the track of sperm, right? And so when we look at sperm here, it actually goes through a system of ducts. So make sure that you understand each of these ducts, if you will, and the path of travel in order of sperm here, right? We started with the duct that we call epididymis, and then we go to the next duct, which is continuous, which is what we call the ductus deferens, then the ejaculatory duct, and then what we call the urethra, right? And so all of this is considered still part of the testes, right? Testes proper. And then we've got accessory sex glands, and these glands actually facilitate the travel of sperm, and then also assist in keeping the sperm motile, alive, enough for it to reach finally an egg, a mature egg in the female, and fertilize, right? And so we talk about the seminal glands, the prostate, and the bulbourethral glands as accessory sex glands, and those plus sperm are going to equal basically semen, right? So that's what we see there. So whatever these secrete, the secretions that they add to sperm is going to equal semen, and we'll take a look at that. We've got a part of this this PowerPoint that discusses that as well. So this is figure 27.5, and 27.5 shows the male reproductive organs. We look at the sagittal view. So in particular, we look at the ducts here, and these are the ducts that first of all talk about or fall in line right next to the testes, and we call that first duct the epididymis, right? And then we've got the ductus deferens, or the vas deferens. We would call this the vas deferens, if you will. And it starts to swing around, if you will, and then becomes then the ejaculatory duct. And here at the ejaculatory duct, once we get into the base of the penis and into the actual penis itself, we would call that the urethra. And again, those are the systems of ducts. And the accessory glands here actually add to sperm, right? One being the seminal gland here, the other one being the prostate, and the small one we call the bulbourethral gland. And they've got secretions that add to semen in the event of ejaculation, which add to sperm and actually do become semen, excuse me, right? Okay, so we'll first start off with the scrotum, right? The scrotum is actually not the testicles themselves, but the scrotum is actually the sac of skin and the fascia, which is connective tissue underlining the skin itself. And we know that the scrotum hangs outside the abdominal pelvic cavity, found at the root of the penis. Here is where we actually have the testes. And in fact, the scrotum, in one of its functions, is to actually have the testes at a 3 degrees centigrade lower temperature than core body temperature. And we know that core body temperature is 98.6 degrees, right? And that's Fahrenheit, so that's equal to about 37 degrees Celsius. And in fact, the testes are at about 34 degrees centigrade, and that's really the reason, one of the major reasons why the scrotum is the scrotum that holds the testes, because when it descends past the internal body cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, it actually lowers the temperature. Now, as it mentions, we got to have a lower temperature because that is necessary for sperm production. And in fact, that is actually true. When you increase the temperature, you actually decrease the amount of sperm that can be produced. And again, that equates to the chance of reproducing. And again, that could be, again, something that might be important, right? All right. There is a septum. We call that the midline septum. And actually, the midline septum is the one that divides the scrotum into two parts, right? So again, each testy is separate from each other, right? It's a separate compartment, even though the scrotum looks like one sac, actually two individual sacs internally, right? So talking about temperature changes and actually how the scrotum can function with that, we've got these two muscles, two sets of muscles here. They call it the dartos muscle, okay, and the cremaster muscle, okay. So when these muscles are in play, in fact, they're the ones that actually can increase the, make the bag looser, make the bag tighter, and then also lift the bag towards the cavity or the root of the penis, and lift the bag basically away from the root of the penis. And again, that's dependent on temperature changes. And again, that can vary depending on external and internal body temperature and how those can change. We see those at play to actually keep that or balance that 3 degrees different temperature than the internal body. So these are the ones that are at play here, okay? So this picture shows many different parts, one being the vascularization there that we don't talk much about. But again, it's highly vascularized. You need a lot of oxygen. You need a lot of, oxygenated blood supply to take away waste, because you are producing, a lot of sperm. A lot of sperm get produced there. And because there's a lot of activity, metabolic activity, you do need a lot of oxygen. And you are, because of metabolism, creating waste. So there's a good amount of vascularization towards the scrotum there. But on this left side, you can actually see the muscle there, the cremaster muscle there as well. And then you can also see the external scrotum there. And then it looks, you can see the fascia as well. So it's an internal connective tissue with the external skin itself. And then you can also start to see the ducts and, different other things here as well. Okay, so each testy, when we're looking at internally into the testes, they actually have two layers of what we call tunics. And if you recall what a tunic is a layer, right? We use this word when we described blood vessels, if you will, because there's 3 different types of tunics of a blood vessel. And so they use this word to describe these 2 layers in the testy, right? The tunica vaginalis is the outer layer, okay? And the tunica albuginea is the inner layer. 2 different types of tissue, okay? 2 different types of tissue here. The inner layer is fibrous tissue, more strong connective tissue, and the outer one is peritoneum, more of a looser connective tissue. So we've got these, after these layers, the internal layer, the albuginea layer, we've got what we call a septa. And what a septa is kind of a division of a testy. And it starts to divide itself into what we call lobules. And there's actually about 250 lobules. And each one of those lobules contain from 1 to 4 what we call seminiferous tubules. And this, in fact, is the place where we have sperm production. So the seminiferous tubules is the place where you're having sperm production. All right, so sperm goes from the seminiferous tubules to a system of other tubes, if you will, and eventually ducts, and they're named here, right? Seminiferous tubule, straight tubule, straight tubular ready testes to efferent ductals, and efferent ductals to finally the epididymis to the vas deferens, right? Vas deferens, and then vas deferens to the ejaculatory duct, and then then ejaculatory duct, eventually to the urethra, right? Okay, so make sure that you know the pathway of sperm as it crosses each of these tubes into these ducts, okay? So the epididymis is made up of 3 areas. We call those the head, body, and tail. So sperm gets produced in the head and body and actually gets stored in the tail. There is a series and time frame of sperm from immaturity to maturity. So there's a time frame of sperm having to get mature. And so these sections of the epididymis allow the sperm to mature over time. We'll look at the time frame there as well. And then the tail is really for storage of sperm. And these are mature sperm. So mature sperm are stored in the tail until ejaculation, right? Okay. So as I mentioned, there's a good amount of blood supply. We call these the testicular arteries and testicular veins. And that's really all you need to know from here. Also the spermatic cord, if you will, as well. So we know that the testicular arteries feed the oxygenated blood there, and the veins actually go into this network, and we call this the pamphiform venous plexus, but that's the network of veins that actually pull this heated blood, this temperature-rich blood, away from the testes and actually cools the testes down. You don't need to know this term here, but you do need to understand that there's an artery and a vein. We call it testicular arteries and testicular veins, and they're found in a anatomical area that we call the spermatic cord. And the spermatic cord is an area that actually not only you find those 2 blood vessels, the arteries and veins, but the nerve fibers and lymphatics that you find in the testes, or actually that feed the testes, if you will. Okay, we call that the spermatic cord. Okay, so testicular arteries, testicular veins, and then spermatic cord. Okay, so you can actually see this in this picture. This is picture 27.7a, and here's where you can actually see the spermatic cord there. Okay, spermatic cord holding the blood vessels and the nerves, right? So we call that the spermatic cord. And then you've got a series of, we can start at the tunica abyginea, and those septums divide into lobules, and here's one lobule pointed out for you, and there's about 250 of those lobules. And then you can start to see that those lobules start to form and are continuous what we call the seminiferous tubules, right? The seminiferous tubules, and this is what the seminiferous tubules are, is where sperm actually gets produced. And so sperm undergoes a series of cell division, especially that are especially for sex cells, and we call that process meiosis that we mentioned in class. And undergoing meiosis, those cells divide and become mini sperm. Those sperm are immature at a certain time point, and then they will travel from the seminiferous tubule into what we call the straight tubule, into the ready testes, the efferent ductile. The efferent ductile is continuous with the head of the epididymis, then becomes the body of the epididymis, and then tail of the epididymis. And so we see the tail here actually start at the very bottom here. Excuse me, let me erase that there. Start at the very bottom and then swing itself all the way up here, all the way up here, and then becomes continuous with the ductus deferens, right? So anything I drew that was in red, follow that line there, that would be the tail of the epididymis. And that's where the site of sperm storage is. And again, this is mature sperm. Okay? So under ejaculation, the sperm will actually travel through the vas deferens and eventually out the penis and ejaculate. Okay? So again, you can see this here, and I wish we had testicles this past week to actually dissect. And it's actually very neat to look at this, because you would see the testy there. You would see this epididymis all through here, and then you would start to see the vas deferens through here as well. Okay, so, or at least part of the vas deferens. But this area right around here is where you find the spermatic. Okay, let's talk about testicular cancer. Very rare, but it usually has, testicular cancer has got a rate here, and it usually will affect a man aged 15 to 35. So it's actually a younger type of cancer, afflicted cancer. So we see mumps relates, right? So there's a correlation between having mumps and then actually getting testicular cancer, and then some other genetic conditions. This one here is where the testes don't descend, so we see that occurring, and that's actually gives you a very high risk of testicular cancer. It's usually a painless solid mass in the testes, and again, it's very rare. And then 90% cure rate, 90% survival rate if found early, right? But just to kind of point out, there is cancer of all tissue, and especially there is cancer of, the reproductive parts as well. Okay, so let's talk about the accessory ducts, right? So their function is to actually carry that sperm past the testes and the epididymis to the body's exterior, right? And they're composed of the epididymis, the ductus deferens, ejaculatory duct, urethra. So again, these are put in order of sperm going to the outside of the body, right? Or where they pass through first, right? And I told you to make sure to understand or know those pathways, and then also know the pathways of the testes, right? Okay? The sperm there in the testes, from where they're made to where they hit the vas deferens, right? Okay, so as I mentioned, sperm gets matured in the epididymis, and in fact, the tail of the epididymis. Okay. So I mentioned that we have a head of the epididymis, right? And those efferent ductals that actually make the immature sperm dump into the head of the epididymis, and that's where the duct will start, first part of the epididymis. And the body and the tail actually is the remainder of a big part of the epididymis, which is, believe it or not, around 6 meters or 20 feet in length. Believe it or not, it's folded on itself, right? Folded on itself. Okay, so pseudostratified epithelial cells are found in the epididymis, right? Lining the epididymis, right? They absorb extra fluid and they pass nutrients to the stored sperm, right? They enable for that, transition of nutrients and waste and so on and so forth from the sperm and back to the sperm, right? All right, so when sperm are immature, they're actually not non-motile. They don't move, if you will, right? So that time where they go from non-motile to motile or movement takes about 20 days, right? So it's a 20-day maturity time from sperm to become immature to mature. And that's really what we talk about. That's what that means when we talk about immature sperm. It's sperm that lack the motility. And in fact, they lack the tail, in fact. They've got a really small tail, and then it actually will form into a larger tail and then actually gain a bunch of different organelles like mitochondria to then perform the job of creating ATP, which causes the energy to move the tail, right? So that 20-day time period is meant for, for the sperm to actually get into that fully mature, full energy tail movement, if you will, right? Now, sperm can actually be stored for several months, perfectly viable in the tail of the epididymis, right? And so during ejaculation, the epididymis will contract, And when it contracts, it's made up of smooth muscle, by the way, right? When that smooth muscle contracts, it actually expels the sperm into the ductus deferens, or we know that to be the vas deferens. It's also known as that. And we see that occurring as well, right? All right, so the vas deferens, 45 centimeters long, goes through the inguinal canal to the pelvic cavity. That's kind of where the ductus deferens, through the spermatic cord, by the way, will go through the inguinal canal to the pelvic cavity. And it expands. It actually gets wider, and we call that area that gets wider and the ampulla, right? And at that point is where it actually joins with the seminal vesicle, and that becomes the ejaculatory duct. Okay, so right at the ampulla where the seminal vesicle meets, we call that then, after that point afterwards, the ejaculatory duct. Okay, so again, the walls of the ductus deferens is made up of smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle contracts and actually pushes the sperm from the epididymis to the urethra, right? So what do we mean when we talk about a vasectomy? A vasectomy is actually cutting and burning. We call this ligating, but burning the ends of the ductus deferens. And again, if you cut that ductus deferens in half and burn the two ends, sperm does that actually get to the actual through the ductus deferens and into the urethra and out of the head of the penis, and thereby no fertilization, right? Okay, so again, we see the same picture we saw before, figure 27.7a, showing the parts there, and you can see where the ductus deferens actually goes through the spermatic cord, right? And that's what we talk about, the inguinal canal to the pelvic cavity, which goes through that area there, and you can see where it's going to travel right here in this picture through that area. Okay, so let's talk about the urethra then, right? The urethra then is a place where sperm will be found, or excuse me, semen now would be found, and urine as well, right? So it's a dual function, right? It's a tube to actually expel urine from the body in a male, and it is a place where we actually expel semen in the male as well. So it actually has dual roles in it, and notice it mentions that it's at different times, because you won't have necessarily urinating at the same time or ejaculating at the same time you're urinating. So it's at different times, and there's a system in place where it'll cut off supply, from the bladder, and then under ejaculation, and vice versa, will cut off supply to the ductus deferens when urinating, right? Okay. So there's three parts of the urethra. We call this the prostatic urethra. This is where the urethra is surrounded by the prostate. So that part of the reproductive system of the male, where the urethra is passing through the prostate, we call that the prostatic urethra. And then immediately after that, we call this part of the urethra the intermediate part of the urethra, also known as the membranous urethra. And the membranous urethra is an area there, and we have that in the urogenital diaphragm, right? Okay, and then the spongy urethra is the part of the urethra where it runs through the penis, right? So again, we can see this here, right? In fact, when we talk about the prostatic urethra, this is at this area here. So we see that there. It's the prostatic urethra. We see that there. And then the intermediate part, kind of found right here at this area. Let me erase that. That would be right there. And then once it gets into the penis, then it becomes this part right here. All through here would be this part of the urethra, right? We call that the spongy urethra. Okay. All right, so onto the penis, right? It's the copulatory organ for the male. So this accomplishes copulation, or the passage of sperm from male to female, right? And so that's the function of the penis per se. But again, you also know that it does have the urethra that is actually a passageway for urine as well, and that's also a function. The external genitalia includes not only the penis but the scrotum. Externally, the penis is composed of what we call the root of the penis and the shaft of the penis, and then also the end of the penis we call the glans penis, right? We would also know this commonly as the head of the penis, right? What we call the prepuce or foreskin is a natural skin that actually covers the head of the penis or the glans penis, right? So it's a loose skin that covers the glans penis there, right? And so when we talk about in healthcare circumcision, it's actually the removal of the foreskin or the prepuce, right? So interesting statistics here, right? 60% of males in the United States are circumcised. In other parts of the world, that drops considerably to 15%. And so when we look internally, the penis is made up of, again, the internal urethra, we call the spongy urethra, and then 3 cylindrical bodies externally from the urethra. So when we look at the spongy urethra, that's the urethra that's right in the center of the penis. And then surrounding that area are these 3 cylindrical bodies, and that's where we have erectile tissue, right? Okay. So erectile tissue is actually a spongy network of connective tissue, and there's actually smooth muscle there, right? And so the bodies that we're talking about fall under the corpus spongulosum or the corpora cavernosa, right? Now the corpus spongilosa is the one that is found immediately around the urethra, and actually forms the glands of the penis and what we call the bulb of the penis, right? The corpora cavernosa is the pair, so this is this is 1 cylindrical body, and this is 2 and 3, because it's a pair, and these are little networks and they're paired and they're found dorsally, so on either end of the penis. And this is where when blood fills up into these little networks of connective tissue, this is where an erection does occur. So speaking of an erection, right, it's erectile tissue that fills with blood, causes the penis to enlarge, becomes rigid. And so we see here it's hard to see at the very end here, but I want to show you then the corpus spongulosum here, and it's right in this dark blue color immediately surrounding the urethra, and hopefully you can see that, and then expands into the glans penis or the head of the penis. So all this tissue here that I just drew in red here would be considered all corpus spongulosum, okay? Immediately surrounding those areas on either end of the penis are 2 cylindrical bodies we call then the corpora cavernosa. And those are the ones that actually filled up with blood, along with the corpus cavernosa, by the way, fill up with blood, and this is where the penis becomes erect. And okay, so let's talk about the perineum, right? So externally, this is a diamond-shaped region, and this diamond-shaped region is a region between the pubic symphysis of the bones themselves, the coccyx, and the ischial tuberosities of either side of the hips there, right? This place is where the scrotum is suspended, and this is where you would have the root of the penis and the anus of the as well. And so looking at it this way, you can actually see the diamond here, so to speak, right? The perineum there, right? So this is the pubic symphysis right here. This is the ischial tuberosity of either of the coxal bones or the hip bone. And then back is the coccyx or the tailbone, right? Found in between this area is this region that we call the perineum, right? So again, the perineum holds the scrotum in place right here. Then internally holds the root of the penis, right? Okay, so you see this as well. Okay, let's talk about these accessory glands, right? The first one we want to talk about is the seminal glands, because this is actually the first one that sperm will unite with, or be added to, right? We look at this at the posterior bladder surface, right? So underneath the bottom part of the bladder is where you would find the seminal gland. Okay, it does have smooth muscle, and when it contracts during ejaculation, it actually will secrete this production of this viscous alkaline, what we call seminal fluid, right? And this is actually made by the seminal gland, stored, and then will be secreted when ejaculation will happen. And this is made up of following things, right? Fructose, citric acid, a coagulating enzyme, and prostaglandin. All of these actually facilitate sperm survival out of the penis and actually into the vagina, right? So I find this very interesting because, for example, fructose is a type of carbohydrate, right? Fructose is a type of carbohydrate. And fructose, in fact, can be used by the sperm to be converted into ATP to continue to be used as energy to move that tail in the vagina. So that's why fructose is there. I also want to kind of point out this one, the coagulating enzyme, right? This coagulating enzyme will cause the semen to coagulate and become sticky and will stick together. And that helps to facilitate it being stuck inside the uterus, right? And prostaglandin actually thins the mucous membrane of the vagina and the uterus as well. And so that hormone actually thins the layer out and actually enables the sperm to pass through, right? Because if it was more mucousy, then sperm would get caught and wouldn't be able to pass through all the way up to the fallopian tube. Okay? So it does have a yellow pigment. This yellow pigment, when UV light is shined upon it, will actually be fluorescent, right? 70% of the volume of semen is actually from the seminal gland, right? And so the duct of the seminal gland joins the vas deferens there, and that forms the ejaculatory duct. And again, that's where I mentioned that's where the meeting place is, becomes the ejaculatory duct. The prostate, okay, again, encircles the urethra. We would call that area of the urethra the prostatic urethra. It's the size of a peach pit, right? A little pit, a little seed inside of a peach. It's about the size of the prostate. It also has smooth muscle. When it contracts during ejaculation, will secrete this milky, slightly acidic fluid, right? So it does have citrate, these enzymes, and this actually activates sperm, actually causes sperm to become even more motile. So it actually kicks the motility up for the sperm. Those tails move much faster there when this gets secreted, and that's really the function of the prostate fluid, right? And again, enters the prostatic urethra during ejaculation, and then 1/3 of the semen volume is actually from the prostate, right? So again, a vast majority is the seminal gland or seminal vesicle, and the seminal fluid, and then we've got prostatic fluid there. And lastly, we have the bulbourethral gland. It's a pea-sized gland. It's inferior to the prostate, produces this clear, thick mucus during sexual arousal. And in fact, its function, it's got two functions. It lubricates the glans penis, or the head of the penis. So this is actually a lubrication secretion, and it actually neutralizes urine in the urethra of the male. So remember that the male has urine and semen both go through it, not at different times again, but both go through it. But there is a little residual, a little bit of urine left over in the urethra, and the bulbourethral glands secretion actually neutralizes any of that remaining urine in the urethra and neutralizes it, because urine is slightly acidic and actually will cause the destruction or inhibition of the sperm traveling. And so this fluid that gets secreted will actually neutralize that urine before it has a chance to actually damage sperm. Interesting. Okay, so we see this figure again, just to kind of go back to it every single time. And the reason why I decided to put this figure several times is because we're actually building on this figure. We're seeing the different parts of what we look at here when we talk about sperm traveling, and that's what we're doing, is trying to go back to each of the figures, to this figure in particular, to kind of go through these parts, right? Okay, so let's talk about this, right? This is we call this benign prostatic hyperplasia, right? And actually, it's a common disease. It's actually very common for males to experience this. And this is actually what happens when you have the increase in size of the prostate. This is what this means, actually. This means the increase in size of the prostate gland, right? So again, about 50% of men age 50 experience the increase of the prostate. Prostate grows in size, and 80% age 70 or above, prostate gets larger and larger, right? So sometimes, depends on the degree of it, you know, how much it grows, if you will. The issue is that it can make urination difficult for males, right? So what it actually does is block off urine, if you will, can actually block the urethra from, you know, sending urine out. So we have an incomplete emptying of the bladder, if you will, and that can lead to UTIs and kidney damage, right? All right, so let's talk about prostate cancer. Third most common cancer in men, right? One out of 6 men in the U.S. experience prostate cancer. So there is a preventative screening of cancer where they look at your prostate, or actually palpate your prostate, and actually look at prostate, an antigen that gets secreted by your prostate. And when that level gets high or higher, then it can be an indicator of prostate cancer, right? And again, the preventative, you know, types of observations are really important, especially in men, right? So in women, at a certain age, it's breast cancer awareness, right? Looking, you know, getting your mammograms and pap smears on a regular basis as a preventative. And for males at a certain age, it's checking your prostate as one of the preventative screenings there as well, in the reproductive area, right? Okay, so again, we're really talking about semen here, right? Semen is actually a milky white mixture of sperm and then all of those secretions that we just talked about, right? So about 2 to 5 milliliters of semen is ejaculated, and believe it or not, in each of those milliliters, 20 to 150 million sperm per milliliter. And that's going to vary tremendously. That's why it's 20 to 150. Varies tremendously on a lot of environmental conditions, the health of the male, nutrition of the male, how many times the male's ejaculated before, many of these, there's many conditions that are involved to kind of change the number from 20 to 150 million. But at the low end, you know, if we just say it's only 2 milliliters and each milliliter has 20 million sperm, that's 60 million sperm in one ejaculation at the low end. I'm just saying, talking about the low end. So that's a tremendous amount of sperm per ejaculation on the low end. Just to, you know, you can do the math and look at 150 times 5 and look at that one. That one's way up there, right? So that is a lot of sperm, right? Okay. I mentioned fructose because fructose is a carbohydrate used for ATP production. Many of those secretions protect and activate the sperm and then actually help the sperm move up the vagina into the urethra and up to the fallopian tubes. Again, that bulbourethral secretion is alkaline, neutralizes the acid, right? It also neutralizes the acidity of the female vagina, enhances motility. So again, all in about the physiology. We already are talking about the physiology per se, but let's talk about this first, right? Okay, so we mentioned what an erection is, right? And so let's look at the penis normally before an erection, right? So the arterioles, which are the blood vessels in the penis, are normally constricted, right? So there are smooth muscles there that actually are continuously contracted and do not allow, for example, blood to pool into those those spongy layers of the penis, right? Under sexual excitement, right, that causes the central nervous system to activate the parasympathetic neurons, and then these arteries that are found in the penis, called the pudendal arteries, will actually release nitric oxide. Nitric oxide causes the relaxation of those smooth muscles. The smooth muscles relax, then let blood pull into that spongy tissue, fill up with blood, and then this is where the penis will become erect and then harden, right? When those smooth muscles relax, arterioles dilate. And let me mention, for example, the sexual drugs, male sexual drugs, which cause, by taking them cause, for erectile dysfunction cause then an erection to occur. And what they really do is they stimulate those arteries to secrete nitric oxide, right? And by stimulating them to secrete nitric oxide, or if they have nitric oxide in them, will cause an erection, right? Okay, so when blood pools into the corpora cavernosum, we call this engorgement, right? The erectile tissue is filled with blood. This is where the penis enlarges and stiffens. The spongulosum keeps the urethra open because it's found around the urethra. It keeps it open, right? And that's important because you don't want the urethra to close. You want to keep that tube open because you want to send eventually sperm through or semen through, right? Okay. Again, sexual stimulation. This can be touch, mechanical stimulation. Again, visual stimulation, sounds, smells. These can all cause this to occur, right? Can all cause this erection to occur, right? All right. So ejaculation, that's taking the semen out of the male, right? Okay. So again, this is actually a sympathetic nervous response. It's from the spinal reflex. Okay, and again, we see the ductus deferens, the vas deferens, Prostate and the seminal glands contract. They go to the prostatic urethra. The internal sphincter of the bladder constricts because we want to cut off supply from the bladder or urine from the bladder. Semen in the urethra triggers a spinal reflex through the somatic neurons. And then those neurons fire back and then to what we call the bulbar sponginosus muscle, and that muscle goes through this real rapid series of contractions, and then it causes the expulsion of semen, right? 500 centimeters a second. That relates to 11 miles per hour. That's really fast, by the way, of semen out of the male at 11 miles an hour, right? So ejaculation that's coupled with intense pleasure is what we call a climax, right? Or an orgasm, right? Blood pressure increases, increased heart rate, because it does affect the entire body, is what we see as a orgasm. So again, this means that when there's an accompaniment, this is what we have an orgasm with. So ejaculation doesn't necessarily need to be coupled with an orgasm, right? What we call resolution after an ejaculation is where everything starts to relax again. Everything goes back to normal. Those arterioles start to be constricted again, because actually this is reverse. We were relaxing those smooth muscles in an erection, ejaculation, and then we constrict them to, cause the sponge, if you will, to not let blood back in. And so we see that there, right? What we call the latent period, just like we do in the nervous system. This is when a man is unable to achieve another orgasm. That can last from minutes to hours, and that latent period increases with age, right? All right, so an erectile dysfunction occurs when the parasympathetic nerves release too little nitrous oxide, and no nitrous oxide or a little nitrous oxide, again, no erection, right? Again, 50% of American males over 40 experience erectile dysfunction. You can have temporary, and that can be, again, when they talk about in your head, mental, psychological factors, overthinking things, this is where what can happen. Alcohol, drugs can actually cause this as well, and things like this, right? Antihypertensive, antidepressants can actually depress the parasympathetic nervous system, which doesn't release any nitrous oxide, which then can cause erectile dysfunction, right? And again, many men experience this because, many men are on hypertensives, right? This is for high blood pressure medication. So again, that's a side effect of it, right? All right, so let's talk about spermatogenesis really quick, right? This is the process of forming the male gametes, right? The sperm, if you will, right? This occurs in the seminiferous tubule, begins at puberty, around 14 years of age or so. Okay, that's an approximate, right? And so here's the statistic there, right? Adult males make about 90 million sperm daily. 90 million. Okay, that's daily, right? So it's a tremendous amount of sperm. Okay, so let's talk about this, right? Seminiferous tubules, they have a thick stratified epithelium. They've got a central fluid lumen, right? And around that lumen, the cells that surround those are the ones that actually some of them make the sperm undergo meiosis, and some of them facilitate that, right? Steatinocytes are the columnar cells. They're supporting cells. They play a role in sperm formation, right? Spermatogenic cells are the cells that surround the cystinocytes and give rise to the sperm. The myoid cells, smooth muscle-like cells, they actually contract and they squeeze sperm and fluid through the tubules. We call these the Leydig cells. These are the interstitial endocrine cells. They produce this, right? These are the ones that actually are responsible for producing testosterone, right? And some estrogen. If you'll notice this, it says some estrogen. So these interstitial endocrine cells, Leydig cells, are the ones that secrete the testosterone and estrogen as well. Because males also produce estrogen, which we think that males only produce testosterone and women only produce estrogen. Again, talking about similarities is to remind you that we're very similar. We males also produce estrogen as well, believe it or not. And females also produce testosterone as well, just not in big numbers, right? So it's different if you're male versus female, okay? Cystinocytes, again, sperm, they act as supporting cells. Spermatogenic cells, just look at the word spermatogenic, right? Genic means genus. Sperm means they produce the sperm. The myoid cells are smooth muscle cells that squeeze the sperm out and the fluid out. And then the endocrine cells are the ones that produce the hormones that we need, right? Okay, so we look at this picture here, and this one's a really interesting one because this is actually where you see where each of those cells lie. And hopefully you got to see this in last week in lab, but it's really important to look at this because it actually will show you these little sections of the seminal. So this is a nice picture, really interesting picture to see here, because you can actually see all these little dots represent the head of the sperm, and then you can also see these little lines, and those lines represent the little tails of the sperm actually going into the lumen, right? And as the myocell, which is surrounding this entire seminiferous tubule, squeezes, they push those through the tubule, right? They push those sperm through the tubule. Okay. All right, so let's just look really quick, right, at the spermatogenesis, right, making of the sperm, right? Again, seminiferous tubules where this happens. Spermatogenic cells make the sperm. They actually undergo meiosis, right? Okay. So we see mitosis of the stem cell. We call that spermatogonia, which is a sperm cell. That's a stem cell. And then it divides, or we see two of those stem cells. And those stem cells, one of them will be turned into a sperm cell, and it'll go into the process of meiosis. And those two daughter cells there are called spermatids, and those spermatids become sperms, genesis, and that's what we see there. Okay, we're not going to go through each of these processes, so don't worry about looking at these major processes here, right? I do want to mention this one here, right? Spermatogenesis takes 64 to 72 days if conditions are hospitable, right? So it takes a good while for spermatogenesis to actually form the cell, the sperm, but from sperm to be immature to mature, 20 days after that. But since this process starts early in life during puberty, it's a continuous process, so it doesn't end. So there's always a good amount. There's no sperm being ran out per se. There's always going to be sperm there that are in some process, either the 64 to 70 days or in the immature phase or already mature. So there's we're still seeing that, right? Sperm are unable to swim during this time. So the fluid that gets pushed, gets that immotile sperm into the epididymis, and then part of maturity is to actually get the motility, right? Okay. We won't talk about sites and what they per se. They just know that they are supporting cells, right? Okay. All right. So let's talk about infertility really quick. Infertility. 1 in 7 couples in America gets affected with infertility. right? It's often because of the sperm quality or the quantity, right? And so we've seen this, and this is a really important thing to stress. And not that this is going to be an exam, but it's just important to understand this for many of you, is that male fertility has actually been declining in the past 50 years. And we're not really sure why. Some of the reasons what we think is going on is there could be environmental toxins, what we call phthalates, which are chemicals that I know some of you were talking about at the very beginning when we talked about the endocrine system. These are solvents from plastic. They're side effects of plastic or found in plastic. Pesticides, herbicides. So we think there's a chemical component, environmental chemical component that we see that's leading to this, but we aren't exactly sure why, which is really neat, right? There's a lot of research involved in trying to figure this out. But again, this is an issue because when we start to see fertility go down in males, then we start to see fertility go down in making more individuals, and we see making more individuals, that can be a big issue for sustainability of the population. Even though we're overpopulating the world, still looking at that is a concern, right? So here's some other things too, and I'll just let you go through that, but this is why we think that could be a combination of these things, or might just be one more closely than anything else, right? Okay, so let's talk about regulation really quick. We're almost done here, right? How we actually maintain this, how much sex hormone, testosterone, estrogen to make and secrete, and how much sperm to produce is actually going through a regulation process, just like in the female. It's going to involve the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, the testes, and I think we talked about this already at the very beginning. Again, we just kind of go back to it, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG, right? And we know that the hypothalamus directs the pituitary, that directs the releases hormones that direct the gonads to then produce certain things, right? So that again involves the gonadal releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, testosterone, inhibin, right? So this picture shows you the relationship between all of those, right? The HPG axis, right? And then we see then how each one of those, right, that the hypothalamus then releases, gonadal releasing hormone, that causes the anterior pituitary to secrete and release follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and then follicle stimulating hormone stimulates spermatogenesis, and then that keeps testosterone really high. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the endocrine cells to secrete more testosterone, and then this causes more spermatogenesis. And again, testosterone affects other places of the body, like libido, sex drive, and things like that. And then there's a negative feedback system, of course, when we secrete testosterone back to the hypothalamus, that causes the hypothalamus to then slow down secretion. And then inhibin, for example, which is released by the cystanocytes, will then cause an inhibition of the release of follicle stimulating hormone. All right, so lastly, I just want to show this, right? This testosterone level and sperm production based on age, right? So we see this kind of up and down here. We see a large increase of testosterone there, right? Okay. Right in, for example, gestation, right? Or in vitro, right? See a large amount of testosterone production. The reason why we see that is because we start to see male reproductive organs and all of that getting set up for males, right? And then we start to see it drop down, right? At birth, we start to see a slight rise here, right? Okay. And then we see it fall down, right? Throughout the years, and then we hit puberty and we start to see this rise in testosterone. We hit a level here, right? So that level is maintained. And then slowly over time, we start to see it going back down, right? So we start to see that production of testosterone, and that's coupled with sperm production. So we start to see puberty right here, and then we start to see sperm production, and then we see it going down.